So today we are discussing updates to our key conservation issues, or our KCIs, in Oregon's State Wildlife Action Plan. We have 7 KCIs addressed in the revised SWAP, and today's focus is on the 4 that ODFW's Wildlife Division led the update on. So those are specifically climate change, pollution, barriers to animal movement, and invasive species. The revision of those other 3 KCIs were led by Habitat Division. Those are water quality and quantity, disruption to disturbance regimes, and land use changes. And these will be addressed in an upcoming meeting. This was a cross-divisional effort supported by staff internally at ODFW, as well as with direct support from external partners with pertinent expertise, like the Northwest Climate Adaptivity Science Center. We do have a handful of our involved staff here today to help answer any questions that you guys might have, though we may need to point you back to some specific staff who aren't with us today if you have more nuanced questions. I also have Rachel Wheat and Carolyn Eckrich here who will help with this presentation. So as we start our conversation on KCIs, we really want to set the stage on how each of those chapters is structured. KCIs are these large-scale conservation issues or threats that affect or potentially affect many species and habitats over large landscapes throughout the state. There's 7 of these KCIs in the revised SWAP, and each of them is structured pretty similarly. So for each of these, we provide background and an issue overview, and this is really intended to provide that broad overview, communicating the magnitude of impacts of each of those KCIs, with some discrete examples to help provide that step-down detail to demonstrate the impacts to a local scale. The background text is really intended to serve as just a starting point for agencies and organizations who are working on those issues to chart their course over the coming decade. It's also intended for landowners and natural resource managers looking for ideas and rationale for conservation actions. These aren't comprehensive, and they can't be. These are the biggest issues that we see wildlife facing in our state. So instead, this is really intended as a broad overview, and we're trying to make sure that they're structured so that way we can connect local issues back to that text. Then, each of these KCIs has goals and actions attributed to it. So these are the high-level conservation goals and actions needed to reduce and reverse the impacts of those KCIs. For all of our recommended actions, implementation needs to be tailored to the project and to the partner. We recognize that in many cases, these are actions that are already occurring, and they should be continued or expanded. And in other cases, new actions are identified. For all of these, success really hinges on cooperative efforts by a variety of entities. And finally, resources and references. So one thing that you'll note in the current Oregon Conservation Strategy, as well as the final product that goes out this fall, is that we don't include references in line. And so this is an active choice that was made in earlier iterations of the strategy, and we're continuing with it. And so the intent here is to really make this accessible to a broad audience. We don't want this to be an impenetrable scientific text. We want to make sure that regardless of your background, this is something that folks can engage with. However, as biologists, this can be challenging. We want to make sure that the references that were used to develop the information are available for when we update information next, as well as to partners who want to learn more. And we want to be clear and transparent about where information is coming from. So where feasible, we connect that information back to key references in the literature. Additionally, state wildlife action plans are really intended to be static documents in between these 10-year revisions, but our understanding of KCIs isn't. By linking out to partner resources and references that are updated more frequently, we can make sure that we're providing up-to-date information over time. So before I hand this over to Rachel to talk more specifically about each of the KCIs today, we want to touch on some of those high-level updates to anticipate in the revised draft. So one thing that we're especially excited about in this revision is that we've integrated threats identified within the 2016 Nearshore Strategy and in the Oregon Conservation Strategy for a more comprehensive presentation on the broad threats impacting fish, wildlife, and habitats. And by moving these into the same document, we're able to provide more inclusive information on how these threats impact all habitats and make this more accessible again to end users. So when we're thinking about these large landscape level impacts, it really makes sense to consider the marine and inland threats together. There's some other large-scale changes in the revisions that we're circulating for comment. So we're adding an entirely new KCI, pollution, which somehow we did not include in earlier iterations in the strategy. We're also moving the information in what used to be a KCI, the challenges and opportunities for private landowners, into the conservation toolbox to really elevate that topic and make that more readily accessible. We also did an overhaul on the climate change KCI with the Northwest Climate Adaptation Science Center to make sure that the information is up to date and reflects the current state of available climate information. And finally, we updated all of the other KCIs, standardizing language used to describe threats, and linking information back to the direct threats classification system to help end users connect with different naming structures between different states' wildlife action plans. So Rachel, I'm going to turn it over to you now to talk a little bit more in depth about each of the 4 KCIs that we're covering today.
Great, thanks, Emily. My name is Rachel Wheat. I am the Wildlife Connectivity Coordinator with the Wildlife Diversity Program at ODFW, and I have been helping to revise these KCIs. And so I'm going to go over today the sort of major overarching changes that were incorporated into the revisions of the 4 KCIs that we're discussing today, starting off with invasive species. So one of the major changes that was made to the invasive species KCI is an expanded section on pathways of introduction. So how these invasive species may make their way into Oregon, the different means by which they may be imported in the pet trade or carried on vehicles or clothing or by our waterways. So there's much more detail now in that section about the different pathways by which some of these invaders can be introduced to the state. We've also revised some of the tables that were in the previous version to make a new updated version. So you may notice that a table that was in the previous version is now no longer there. And instead, we've replaced that with a new table highlighting impacts of a subset of high-profile invaders, things like quagga and zebra mussels, American bullfrog, and some other high-profile invasive species that details the impacts that those invaders have directly on fish, wildlife, or habitats within Oregon. We also have a second new table that's identifying examples of potential invaders that have not yet made their way to Oregon, but may make their way into Oregon soon, that we want to keep an eye out for. These are species that have been documented in surrounding states that are causing economic and ecological damage, and we want to be aware of these species and keep an eye out for those as they may or may not move into the state. And finally, within invasive species, we have updated and expanded the goals and action section with some new goals and actions to help target specific conservation intervention to help prevent invasive species from becoming established in Oregon and for addressing invasive species that are already here. We do have a couple specific questions in mind for our technical reviewers that we would like folks to think through as they provide feedback and comments to us on these KCIs. So for invasive species KCIs specifically, we would like some information on how we should be addressing those non-native species that have been introduced to the state that may not meet the technical definition of invasive species, but can still be harmful to native species and their habitats. So these would be species like, for example, chukar or bass that were introduced for sport purposes that aren't technically invasive species under the technical definition, but they do still have impacts to native species and their habitats. So some feedback that could be helpful from our technical reviewers would be how we should address that within this KCI. So that's one thing that would be helpful to think through when you're providing feedback on these revisions. The second KCI that we're going to be discussing today is barriers to animal movement. This is the KCI that addresses fish and wildlife habitat connectivity throughout the state. So the major changes that were made to barriers to animal movement include our updated statewide fish passage priority barrier list, which was just approved by our commission earlier in April of this year. We've also changed the text on terrestrial wildlife connectivity to have better alignment with the Oregon Wildlife Corridor Action Plan. So the Oregon Wildlife Corridor Action Plan was a legislative requirement, a state legislative requirement for ODFW that was completed in January of 2024. And now the updated barriers to animal movement text aligns more closely with the text found in the Oregon Wildlife Corridor Action Plan. Also within the terrestrial animal movement section, we have restructured actions under Goal 2, and we included a couple new actions that are specific to energy development and resource extraction, agricultural areas, and outdoor recreation. So acknowledging some of these threats that weren't particularly well covered in previous iterations or did not have specific actions in previous iterations of the State Wildlife Action Plan. We now have specific actions for barriers to animal movement targeting those activities. And finally, of course, as part of the development of the Oregon Wildlife Corridor Action Plan, ODFW has delineated these priority wildlife connectivity areas within the state. These are the parts of Oregon's landscape with the highest overall value for facilitating wildlife movement and maintaining connectivity. And so we've integrated priority wildlife connectivity areas within the barriers to animal movement section, references and links in several locations throughout, so that as users are reading the information within the barriers to animal movement KCI, they can be directed to those priority wildlife connectivity areas as a resource for conservation action on the ground. One of the specific questions that we have for reviewers for barriers to animal movement is whether our reviewers have any recommendations for spotlight sessions to highlight current exciting efforts that are being done in the state to help improve the movement of fish, wildlife, or marine species. So as Emily mentioned in the introduction, these KCIs are meant to provide a very broad overview of these issues at a landscape scale, statewide, throughout Oregon. But we know that there's lots of individual work being done at local or regional scales to help combat some of these conservation threats. And so one of the ways that we integrate those within our State Wildlife Action Plan are these sections called spotlights. So in the current iteration of barriers to animal movement, we've had a spotlight on the Gilchrist crossing structure on US 97. Prior to that, we had a spotlight on the Lava Butte wildlife crossing structure on US 97. But we know that there's a variety of restoration work, fencing removal work, land acquisition work, transportation mitigation work, et cetera, throughout the state that are these nice local or regional actions that are improving barriers to animal movement or improving connectivity. And so if folks have any specific recommendations for spotlights that they would like to see on those local or regional efforts that we can incorporate and kind of bring down the high level key conservation issue to a local or regional scale with some specific examples, that would be helpful. And that goes not just for barriers to animal movement, but for our other KCIs as well. The third KCI is our climate change KCI, and this of the four that we're discussing today probably had the greatest overhaul. Emily mentioned that we worked very closely with the Northwest Climate Adaptation Science Center, specifically Lindsay Thurman, to update the information within this KCI to more accurately reflect improvements in climate science that have occurred over the last decade and new climate models that have been released over the last decade. So, of course, since these state wildlife action plans really don't go under much revision within that decadal timescale, a lot changes over 10 years in terms of the advancement of science and our understanding of climate change impacts and projected future impacts of changing climate conditions on fish, wildlife, and habitats. So we have made significant improvements to our climate change KCI, reflecting the current best understanding of predicted climate futures and the ways that those climate changes are expected to impact our habitat, our fish, and our wildlife. We've also better integrated impacts to marine systems. So again, as Emily mentioned, we have worked on combining the nearshore strategy with the Oregon conservation strategy in the State Wildlife Action Plan update so that all of these KCIs reflect impacts not just to terrestrial and freshwater systems, but to marine systems as well. So you'll see that reflected in this KCI with information on things like ocean warming and ocean acidification and hypoxia. We've also provided updated resources, a large resource bank with resources for different climate data sets, climate adaptation toolkits, and other information that's expected to be helpful for our practitioners that are working on the ground to help combat some of these changing climate conditions. One of the specific questions that we have for our technical reviewers for the climate change KCI is this question about to what extent we should describe and explain the way that climate modeling works. So throughout this text, especially in some of the figures that we've used within the KCI, you'll notice mention of a couple different climate models, including RCP and SSP models, which we have not to date defined in any way in the text. So our question to our technical reviewers is, should we include information on these specific climate models? So should we describe what the different climate models are, how they work, the differences between them? And if so, how should we do that? What's the most accessible way for us to do that? For example, would a glossary of terms be helpful? Or should we include a separate section that goes through and discusses climate models? Or, for example, should we just have a pop-up within the website? So if you hover your mouse over the name of one of the climate models, a pop-up will show up with some information about that specific model and what it is. The final KCI that we're discussing here today is the brand new KCI on pollution. So we have nothing to compare this to because this is new for us, brand new document that is covering as many types of pollution as we could think of. If you can think of more that you feel like deserve attention, please let us know. So the pollution section breaks down the different types of pollution within the state and has major sections illustrating waterborne pollution, industrial pollution, agricultural and forestry pollution, solid waste pollution, air pollution, and then noise and light pollution as well. And within each of those categories, we discuss major pollutants and then their impacts on habitat, as well as potential impacts to fish, wildlife, and marine species. Within the pollution KCI, we've also included a section that provides an overview of federal and state regulations that guide pollution management within Oregon. We understand that this is likely not a comprehensive list, so this would be another opportunity for our technical reviewers to provide feedback on other policies that we should include here. And we've also provided some resources that can help practitioners guide pollution management and other conservation work to help reduce pollution impacts within Oregon. So the asks for this pollution KCI are a little bit broader than the other KCIs since this is a new document for us. First and foremost, this is a very high level question. Do we need to provide a definition of pollution? This is not something that we currently do, but would this be helpful? Should we define what pollution is at the top of the KCI before any of the other text? The other two questions I mentioned, which are there any additional policies that we need to highlight? Is there any additional legislation that we have not included either at the federal or the state level that may be helpful to highlight just to provide that regulatory framework for the way that pollution is managed in the state? And then lastly, are there additional resources out there that have provided value to you in your work that you feel like would be helpful to include? So as we guide users of our State Wildlife Action Plan to specific tools and resources to help combat pollution in the state and to help mitigate the impacts of pollution on fish, wildlife, and habitats, what are the resources that have been most helpful to you that we can direct users to outside of the State Wildlife Action Plan?
So we just heard about the updates that we have made, and Rachel pointed out some of the outstanding questions that we have for each section. Any feedback that you have to answer those questions is really appreciated. But in general, I just wanted to go over sort of what opportunities there are for our technical reviewers. We are hoping that our technical partners can review the information that we provided for each KCI, check that for factual accuracy, and help us to identify missing or out-of-date information. We are also looking for help to review the goals and actions for each KCI and identify any additional information needs or actions that are critical to conservation in Oregon. The conservation actions are a major element of the SWAP, and they influence conservation work, partnerships, and conservation spending. So please help us to ensure that they are comprehensive. And if you have any proposed changes or additions, we ask that reviewers submit peer-reviewed references and supporting materials that can help us to inform final drafts, along with the information that you would like us to change or include. We also recognize the value of traditional and cultural information in addition to scientific data to support those changes. And we also ask that you please include references to line numbers that you'll find in all of the documents that are posted online to aid in reviewing and incorporating comments. Next slide, please. So our ask for reviewers, with this background in mind, we would love for you to add your expertise to ensure that the 2025 SWAP will be the most accurate, highly functional tool for the state. Please reflect on the sections that we reviewed today and keep in mind if you have information to share. Broadly, our ask is for partners to review the information we provided, and if gaps are identified, to provide information to fill those gaps. Remember that the SWAP is a document that is widely available and heavily used with over 120,000 unique users each year. And we want to ensure that we are including high quality information on threats and conservation actions so that we are supporting effective conservation by practitioners around the state. Next slide, please. So to help document your feedback, we have provided a form on the revision website. Though we will be taking notes today, please use this tool to provide us with your comments. This helps us to maintain better records of comments and the discussion. Utilizing the comment form helps us to organize your questions and the feedback into different sections of the plan and to get that information out to the appropriate places in our agency to consider it. We are asking that all feedback related to today's meeting be submitted by May 13th. This allows us time to address those comments and make changes to these sections while continuing the review process with other sections. This also helps us to ensure that we are not overwhelmed with all SWAP comments all at once. And a reminder to please reference those line numbers where applicable to help us in reviewing and incorporating comments.